Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Sophie deftly fastened her earring, the final touch to her look, and glanced at her reflection in the mirror. The black dress was tight around her slender figure, the high heels adding grace to her posture. A little bolder than usual, but it was just a bachelorette party. Just a fun night out with her friends. The smell of coffee wafted from the kitchen. She headed that way, adjusting the thin gold bracelet on her wrist. "You look like you're going hunting," Mark smiled, setting a cup of cappuccino in front of her. He looked habitually relaxed, wearing a homemade t-shirt and a light stubble. The same man she'd spent the last 15 years with, and all that time he'd given her no reason to question their marriage. Love, trust, familiar rituals, they had it all. The girls decided to have a night out at a nice club, she explained, taking the cup in her hands. "Yeah, good one." Mark looked at her, stopping at her exposed shoulders, the curve of her hip. His gaze was still warm, but a shadow of something elusive flickered in it. Sophie took a sip of coffee, savoring the flavor. "I won't be long. We'll sit, chat, have a cocktail, and then go home." He stepped closer, gently tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. "If I don't take you away." "Silly," she grinned, clapping him playfully on the shoulder. But something about that phrase left a strange feeling. Mark wasn't jealous. He never controlled her, never asked unnecessary questions. Their relationship was built on respect and freedom, which was why it was so strong. And yet, "Don't come back late," he said in a different tone, as if he meant it. Sophie felt something tingle inside her. "I promise." She finished her coffee, kissed him on the cheek, and picked up her small purse from the chair. "Are you sure you don't mind?" she asked, standing in the doorway. "Sophie, I don't mind. Have fun." He smiled, but she noticed that it was a little restrained. As she left the house, she saw her husband standing at the window, watching her. The rumble of the bass got under her skin, making her heart beat in time with the music. Sophie stepped into the semi-darkness of the club, feeling the warmth and humid air, saturated with the sense of expensive perfume, mingle with the spicy odor of alcohol. Flashes of neon light cut through the darkness, catching the silhouettes of dancing bodies, scattering glare on the shiny glasses with cocktails. Her friends were already pulling her toward the bar. Maggie, laughing, clapped her on the shoulder. "So, Mrs., I'll be home early. Still sure about that?" Sophie smiled, though she was already starting to feel a familiar excitement inside. These parties always started the same way, a light laugh, a couple of cocktails, a chat about life. But once the alcohol melted the caution, everything changed. Boundaries blurred. The night opened doors that on a normal day no one would have walked through. "Let's have a drink first, and then we'll see," she said, taking the amber mojito glass from her friend's hands. The first sip was cool, refreshing, but it was followed by a second, bolder one. Sophie could feel the tension slowly fading away, giving way to lightness. The music was calling to the dance floor, and she gave into that call, letting her friends pull her into the pulsing crowd. The club had a life of its own. People moving to the beat, someone laughing somewhere, someone whispering something in her ear to be heard amidst the cacophony of sounds. Sophie closed her eyes, letting the music lead her. She could feel her body swaying, her muscles relaxing, her heels sliding confidently across the floor, keeping her movements smooth. The alcohol was doing its job. Every second became a little slower, every look a little more candid. And that's when she felt his gaze. Somewhere off to the side, at the edge of the dance floor, someone was watching her. She opened her eyes and found him immediately. Tall, dark-haired. His face was hidden in the semi-darkness, but his cheekbones and chin were clearly visible. His white shirt was a couple buttons undone, his wrist adorned with an expensive watch. He stood, unmoving, making no attempt to approach. Just stared. Sophie felt something inside her clench. Not fear, not discomfort, more like arousal. She looked away, pretended she hadn't noticed. But a moment later, she caught his gaze again, and then again. He kept his eyes on her. And with each passing second, she remembered less and less who she was. Less and less she remembered who she'd come with. Less and less she thought about who was waiting for her at home. The dance floor vibrated beneath my feet, flashes of light tearing the darkness. Everything around them mingled. Voices, Laughter, muffled conversations, the scent of alcohol and heated bodies. Sophie could still feel his gaze on her. He didn't look away. He didn't back away. He didn't even make an attempt to move closer, just stood there, letting her decide for herself if she wanted to continue. And she did. She didn't think. Her body moved on its own, the crowd parting in front of her as she took a step toward him. He stayed where he was, but something in his posture had changed, a slight tension in his shoulders, a subtle grin, a shadow of expectation. Sophie stopped in front of him. He was taller than he appeared from afar. The eyes were dark, deep, mocking. His cheekbone line was sharply defined, his lips slightly open, as if he were about to say something. But there were no words. There was no exchange of names. There were no awkward phrases. There wasn't even the usual, "Do you come here often?" There was only silence between the thumps of the bass. He leaned closer. She felt his breath. Warm, spicy, tinged with whiskey, with the slight odor of expensive cologne. He had the confidence of a man who knew what he was doing. Her breathing quickened. She didn't take a step back. He waited, almost didn't move, only tilted his head slightly to the side, as if studying her reaction. One movement left. One step. She made it. Sophie had no time to realize what she was doing. In an instant, everything just happened. Her lips met his. They touched lightly, barely perceptible, as if testing a boundary. And then that boundary was gone. He didn't let her pull away. His hand slid to her waist, his warm palm closed around her back, pulling her closer. His other hand traveled down her shoulder, digging his fingers into her hair. Sophie felt her insides clench at that touch. He kissed her slowly but with predatory confidence, stretching out the pleasure. She felt her fingers slide up his chest on their own, as if trying to find a foothold. It didn't feel right, but she didn't care. She kissed him like she was forgetting who she was, as if the world outside the dance floor ceased to exist. Somewhere very close by, her friends' laughter rang out, the flash of the phone illuminating their silhouettes. Someone could see, but even that didn't make her stop. His lips moved along her neck, his breath burning her skin. Her body responded to his every gesture. Sophie closed her eyes. "Let's get out of here." His voice sounded at her ear. Her hand was in his palm when exactly that happened. Sophie didn't know. She didn't pull away. He led her confidently through the crowd, cutting through the air with his posture, his stride, his unmistakable knowledge of where they were going. The crowd parted before them. Camera flashes flickered in the periphery of their vision, but the faces around them were blurred. Someone might have spotted them. Someone might have recognized them. But Sophie wasn't looking around. She wasn't thinking, only felt. Felt the man's hot hand sliding down her back, lingering briefly on her waist, guiding her behind him. Felt the blood pulsing in her temples, the heels beating the rhythm of her accelerated heartbeat. Stairs. They went up to the second floor, where the noise of the party seemed muted. It was darker here, the soft light of velvet lamps barely illuminating a corridor with massive doors. There were almost no people. Only sparse silhouettes merged into the shadows, muffled conversations, whispers. He stopped in front of one of the doors and turned to her. Sophie could have said no, could have turned around and walked away. It was all in her hands. But when he stepped aside, opening the door, inviting her inside, she took a step forward, and the door closed. Somewhere behind her, the party continued. Music was blaring, people were laughing, cocktails were mixing in glasses, someone was celebrating a birthday, someone was just living this evening like there was no tomorrow. But here, behind this door, the world ceased to exist. Only the dark room, only his figure in the semi-darkness, only her, holding her breath in anticipation. She heard him lock the door with a latch. The slight click echoed heavy in her chest. No turning back. His hand slid slowly over her shoulders, softly but surely. She could feel the warmth of his palms, even through the thin fabric of her dress. He took his time, as if giving her time to realize where she was and what she was doing. She could have stopped it, but she didn't. He leaned closer so that his breath burned her skin. When his lips first touched her skin, it was like an electric shock. She exhaled quietly, bowing her head slightly, letting him go on. And he continued. His lips moved slowly, exploring her neck, her collarbones, leaving light, barely perceptible traces. His hands, gently encircling her waist, drew her closer, making her feel his warmth. In that moment, she completely dissolved into the sensation. It was like music, like a rhythm she could only hear inside herself. She looked up, meeting his gaze. It was the very moment when no words were needed. Everything was said without them, in the depth of his eyes, in the slight chuckle on his lips, in the way he leaned closer, tearing down the last barriers. And when their lips met, the world around them disappeared. Just them, just this moment stretching into infinity. Only their breaths merging into one. Only the heat of their bodies, which didn't cool, but only grew hotter. Her hands slid slowly over his shoulders, her fingers buried in his hair. She couldn't think of anything but the sensation he was everywhere. His voice, his touch, his scent all filled her to the brim. He lifted her chin, looking into her eyes as if he saw the real her. No masks, no hidden emotions. And her heart seemed about to burst out her chest. This wasn't passion for passion's sake. It was something more, something inexplicable, like a hurricane sweeping away everything in its path, like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long storm, like a flash of lightning in the night. They belonged to this second, completely dissolving into it as if the world outside this room no longer existed. The bright morning light shone through the sliding curtains, hitting her directly in the eyes, as if someone deliberately wanted to bring her back to reality as harshly as possible. Her head was buzzing, her body felt like absorbent cotton, and her lips were dry. Sophie groaned weakly, rolling over onto her other side, trying to hide from the merciless sun. Where was she? Her head felt heavy, her thoughts jumbled like tangled threads that couldn't be untangled in one motion. She felt the coldness of the sheets on her bare skin, and only then realized she was wearing nothing. And then fragments of memories came flooding back. Hands sliding over her body, hot breath on her skin, muffled laughter, the sound of clothes falling to the floor. Sensual, insistent lips leaving her no choice. Someone else's lips, not Mark's. Her heart clenched. She opened her eyes abruptly and at the same moment heard a voice. "Good morning. I hope the evening was as good as the contract I'm about to sign with your husband." It was as if time had stopped. Sophie froze, barely breathing, her gaze slowly creeping to the side. Him, the same man, calm, confident, not even trying to hide a satisfied smirk. He sat on the edge of the bed, pulling his shirt on carelessly, his gaze assessing her reaction. She felt everything go cold inside. No, this couldn't be happening. But his voice, his confident posture, the tone that held a slight sneer, it was all too real. "You." Her voice treacherously trembled. He leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on his knees, and held out his hand to her, as if they were in a business meeting. "Evan Carlyle. A pleasure." Her blood ran cold. That name. It sounded familiar. Too familiar. Sophie slowly sat up on the bed, barely covering herself with the blanket, feeling panic begin to build in her chest. "Carlyle." The word stuck in her throat. He nodded, keeping his gaze on her. "Yes, that Carlyle. The one your husband is supposed to meet with this afternoon to seal the deal." She felt the room swim before her eyes. Oh my God, what have I done? Her head was spinning, thoughts swarming haphazardly in her cloudy head. Sophie clutched the corner of the blanket in her hands, feeling her palms grow damp. He was silent, just sat across from her, crossing his legs and looking as if he was waiting for her next move. God, what have I done? What am I supposed to do now? The thought was spinning around in her head like a broken record. Husband. She couldn't let him find out. She couldn't let this night ruin what they'd been building for so many years. Why are you telling me this? Her voice sounded shaky, but she tried to make it firm. He shrugged, as if her question really surprised him. Just thought you should know. But you're not going to dash. She stopped talking, realizing she couldn't say those words out loud. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes gleaming with a sly squint. Not going to what? Tell your husband? Of course not. That would be too easy. Her breath hitched. His words sounded like a promise and a threat at the same time. She couldn't tell if he was joking or serious. "Then why are you here?" she blurted out, trying not to look him in the eye. He rose slowly from his chair, walking to the window. The light coming through the curtains illuminated his profile. He seemed perfectly calm, even relaxed, like a man holding cards known only to him. "I'm here because we had a good night," he said, turning to her. "Didn't we?" Sophie felt her cheeks blaze with shame. She knew her attempts to keep her composure looked pathetic. "I just want to understand what you want," she said, struggling to keep her voice from trembling. He walked back to the bed, stopping in front of her. His gaze became serious. "Nothing. Nothing at all," he said quietly, but it made his words sound even more ominous. "Just be yourself, Sophie." The phrase hung in the air, filling the room with tension. She clutched the blanket tighter, feeling her palms sweat. Her head was screaming, "Say something, do something." But he didn't say anything else. Just smirked, like a man who knows something she doesn't. That smirk was enough to start the alarm bells ringing in her head, a harbinger that trouble was yet to come. Sophie got home around noon, still feeling an uncomfortable heaviness in her chest. She had spent the morning trying to deal with the chaos in her head. Her mind felt like it was torn between two worlds, the familiar, measured routine of life and what had happened last night. When she walked into the living room, Mark was sitting on the couch, looking at some document on his clipboard with a smile. He looked so content, so relaxed. "Hi, honey," he said, raising his eyes to her. "How was the bachelorette party?" "Good," she replied, trying to sound as calm as possible. He nodded, going back to his reading. "I have something interesting for us," he said after a moment, still smiling. Sophie froze, trying to detect a catch in his words. "Yes? What is it?" "I have an important meeting with a potential partner today. We've recently discussed cooperation, and it seems he's determined to make a big deal." He put the clipboard on the table and stood up. "Could you keep me company? He wants to meet my wife." Her heart skipped a beat. "Your wife?" she asked, trying not to show her excitement. "Yes." He said he valued family values and wanted to get to know us better. Mark walked over to her and put his arm around her waist. "Don't worry, you just need to be yourself." She smiled nervously, desperately trying to think of ways to avoid this meeting. But nothing came to mind. "Okay, I'll go," she said, barely audible. Mark kissed her on the cheek and started to get ready, and Sophie was left standing in the living room, feeling her insides grow cold. Later, they entered a spacious office, austere, furnished, and decorated with paintings. Mark looked focused but confident. He didn't let go of her hand, showing that she was his support. "This is my partner," he said, pointing to the solid oak door. "We're about to meet." Sophie held her breath as the secretary opened the door. The moment she saw the man enter the room, her heart stopped. It was him, the very same one. The man who had seemed to disappear that morning, leaving only his words, his presence in her memory. And now he was standing in front of her again, and looking at her. The corners of his lips played with the shadow of the very smirk she had been so afraid to see. Mark stepped forward, holding out his hand. "Nice to meet you," he said, full of confidence. Sophie stood still, her legs feeling heavy and her palms sweating. She was afraid to move, afraid that he would speak, that he would say something unnecessary. The man stepped closer, shook Mark's hand, then turned his gaze to her. "Nice to meet you," he said as if nothing had happened. But his eyes, that slight squint, that barely perceptible smile, said something else. Evan Carlyle shook Mark's hand with a slight smile. His gaze relaxed, but there was a predatory interest in the depths of his eyes. He didn't take his eyes off her, not for a moment. Sophie felt her insides clench. Wet palms, the trembling in her fingertips, the muffled hum in her ears. She couldn't control the situation, couldn't predict what he would say. "Nice to meet you, Mark," Carlyle said with a slight croak in his voice. "I've heard a lot about you." "Likewise," her husband replied, with genuine enthusiasm. Mark turned to her, as if he had remembered to introduce them to each other. "This is my wife, Sophie," he said proudly. Carlyle smiled. "Sophie," he said slowly, as if tasting her name. She could see him savoring the moment. "Yes, we've met before," he said, keeping his gaze on her. Everything shivered in her chest. Mark's eyes flashed with curiosity, and he turned to her. Yes? Where? Carlyle took a step closer, smoothly, confidently, as if drawing out the scene, stretching the pleasure. Not long ago, he stretched out. A coincidence that the world is so small. He didn't say too much, but he'd said enough. Sophie interlocked her fingers tightly in front of her, trying to hide a shiver. She couldn't let her emotions show. Yes, we met by chance, she said in a steady voice. Carlyle watched her with the same attention a cat watches a mouse huddled in a corner. Not long ago, he repeated, pausing. That was enough for Mark. He hummed and clapped Carlyle on the shoulder. Well, now you'll have more time to get to know each other, he said, not noticing anything strange. Carlyle smiled. No doubt about it. Sophie clenched her jaws. What does he want? What is he trying to accomplish? Let's sit down, Mark suggested, pointing to the conference table. They settled into comfortable chairs, facing each other. Carlyle leaned back relaxed, his gaze sliding over her before he turned to Mark again. Mark, he began slowly, leaning back. I like your approach to business. The transparency, the trust. He paused, his fingers tapping the arm of the chair. Trust is a rare thing, isn't it, Sophie? She felt everything sink inside. Mark frowned slightly, glancing at her, then back at Carlyle. Yes, of course, trust is the basis of everything, he replied. Carlyle smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. Exactly. That's why I value honesty. Sophie felt a lump come up at her throat. He won't tell. He won't tell. I'm sure we'll find common ground, Carlyle continued, leaning forward slightly. Business is about relationships. When you really know someone, the job is easier. He looked at her. She realized he was playing with her. Her breathing quickened. Mark smiled, not noticing the undercurrent. Exactly. Let's discuss the details of the contract. Carlyle shifted his gaze to him, but there was still a glimmer of predatory play in his eyes. Of course, he replied calmly. Sophie realized that she was no longer in control of the situation. There was a tense silence in the room. Mark looked away from the papers, frowning, then back at his wife, then back at Carlyle. What do you mean? His voice was steady, but there was a note of wariness in it. Evan Carlyle leaned back in his chair, watching Sophie with a slight smile. He was clearly enjoying this moment. Oh, Mark, he said with deliberate laziness. I'm talking about the night your wife and I spent together. Sophie felt her breath catch. She couldn't move, couldn't get a word out. Mark froze. The office was suddenly unnaturally quiet. What? He asked quietly. Carlyle turned to her, as if inviting her to tell her. Your wife, he said slowly, deliberately, spent the night with me. Just the other night. In the VIP room at the club, to be exact. Sophie watched her husband's face change. The way the muscles in his jaw tensed. The way something wild flashed in his eyes. Sophie? He turned to her, his voice low, raspy. She tried to speak, but her lips wouldn't obey. It's not true. Her voice shook, but it was too late. Carlyle laughed. Oh, let's not. He pinched the bridge of his nose with his fingers, as if he were tired of this game. You know, Mark, I wouldn't tell you this, but your wife is too good at pretending. Mark clenched his fists. You're lying. Am I? Carlyle leaned closer, his voice almost friendly. Your wife came back this morning. What do you think she was? Mark shifted his gaze to Sophie. Sophie? She felt something tighten her chest, her throat dry with fear. Was with my friends, she mumbled, but her voice was barely audible. Carlyle grinned and leaned over to Mark. Look, I don't like breaking up families, he said almost regretfully. But I do appreciate honesty, in business as well as in life. And if you're willing to work with me, you need to know who you're sharing a bed with. Mark was silent. He looked at her, but his eyes were empty. That's not true, she whispered. But at that moment, he no longer believed her. Carlyle stood up, picked up his pen, signed the contract, and smiled as he left the document on the table. Always happy to work with open-minded people, he said, and left the office. Mark still hadn't moved. Sophie wanted to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. And then he stood up. He pushed back his chair with a jerk. He looked at her in a way he'd never looked at her before. And in his eyes, she didn't see rage. Worse, there was emptiness. Sophie, tell me the truth. She didn't say anything. because in that moment, she knew there was nothing she could do. There was silence in the room. Sophie looked at Mark, saw his face growing harder, colder. "Sophie, tell me the truth," he repeated. She couldn't. She couldn't because she knew that if she did, it would be the end of everything. But he already knew. Carlyle had given him enough. Mark exhaled sharply, stepped back, as if trying to distance himself, not only physically but emotionally. "So, that's it." His voice was quiet, almost colorless. She took a step toward him, but he immediately raised his hand, stopping her. "Don't you dare," he said icily. Sophie swallowed. "It was a mistake," she mumbled. He grinned bitterly. "A mistake?" he repeated. "A mistake is forgetting your wedding anniversary. And you became a doormat." She saw his fingers clench into fists, but he kept his cool. "When?" he finally asked. She lowered her eyes. "After the club?" Mark nodded, as if that information didn't change anything. "How many times?" Sophie swallowed. "One." He looked at her in a way that made her want to disappear. "You don't think it matters?" She didn't say anything. He turned around, walked over to the desk, grabbed his phone, and dropped it briefly. "When I get back, you won't be here." "Wait." She rushed to him, grabbed his arm. He stopped, but didn't turn around. "Mark, please, let's talk." "About what?" "About how you fucked the man I was going into business with. About how now, every time I hear his name, I'll be reminded of what you did." She felt nausea coming up her throat. "I love you." He snorted. "Don't make me laugh." He pulled his arm out and headed for the exit. "I can't just leave," she said pleadingly. He stopped at the door, but didn't turn around. She was already gone. He walked out, slamming the door. When Sophie got home, her suitcases were already at the front door. The things were stacked neatly, without hysteria or chaos, which made the picture even scarier. On the nightstand was her cell phone, her wallet, her wedding ring. A note. "I hope it was worth it." Sophie felt her legs jacking up. She wanted to call him, but she knew he wouldn't pick up. Her life, she'd spent 15 years building, was over in one night. And Carlyle? He'd won. Her husband was no longer hers. The marriage is over. And in that moment, Sophie realized she had nothing. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.